Hi, and Merry Christmas to you. It's great to be with you for this Trinity College Chapel. And I'm hoping to have some of you in my classes this next semester, maybe Darwin or Design, Miracles of Christ, ethical and theological issues in the contemporary era. But it's great to be able to share something of my heart about God's heart for us and about capturing our heart for Him. You know, you've heard of The Great Gatsby. It's a book by F. Scott Fitzgerald, became a famous movie. You've heard about The Great Adventure and The Great Train Robbery. What I'd like to talk about today is God's great heart capture. God in Christ, in coming to earth, is entering into enemy-held territory. And He's on a mission. He wants to capture our hearts. And if we've already received Him as Lord and Savior, if we've trusted that Christ died for us, took our place in righteous judgment, and rose again from the dead, and is the living King, the universe's ruler, rightful ruler, then we can render our lives to Him every day. And that's part of the excitement, that's part of the joy and the thrill of God's heart capture. Someone has said, coming to know Christ is a little bit being introduced to your life partner, in the sense that you get to know that person more and more, and then you realize that, wow, this is the most amazing person I've ever met. I remember falling in love with my wife, Normandy, and as we were beginning to date, and even before I wrote her kind of a bombshell letter telling her of my feelings, I had the phenomenon I couldn't stop thinking about her for a period of days. And I finally wrote this letter from Dallas to South Carolina, and the rest is history. And we were married a little bit under a year later. So what I think that we see here is God entering. Christmas is the celebration of God becoming man, the second person of this triune love fellowship, this fantastic expression of love from outside of time, from eternity's perspective, the shores of eternity. God enters time and space in this very fragile form of a human baby. You know, C.S. Lewis spoke of this. He spoke of God entering enemy-held territory. He even said in Mere Christianity, enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. And God is the story of the rightful king. The rightful king has landed, and you might say landed in disguise. And He's invited us to take part in a great campaign of sabotage, so we get to be involved with this invading force. May say that that's kind of a strange metaphor. It's like the Normandy invasion. Well, yes, in this case, there were 156,000 Allied troops, about half of them American, about half of them were British or Canadian. And that group of 156,000 were involved in the first 24 hours, invading France. But God invaded not in huge army, but in the person of Christ. One person invaded enemy-held territory. And that was way more than the 156,000 in its effect, because it didn't just liberate a country for a generation. It liberated the lost of planet Earth for all eternity. And so I'd like to think about how God, in the coming of Christ and the celebration at Christmas, God invites us to think about how He has captured our heart in this invasion of humanity in the person of Christ. And I came up with 3 ways, and we're going to spend a few moments on each of these 3 ways, 3 angles, 3 captivating facets of God's invasion and capture of our heart. So this is the great heart capture, and it happens, first of all, as we see Him invading in humanity, in a form of a human being. You would say, well, what's the big deal? Couldn't God have just come down as God? After all, we study at Trinity College how the angel of the Lord appears here and there, in the Old Testament, appears to Moses at the burning bush, appears to Joshua in the form of a general of an army, appears to many other saints of the Old Testament. And this mysterious figure seems to be more than just an ordinary great angel. He seems to be speaking and acting as if he were God. So couldn't the great angel of the Lord come? Well, no, because only a man, a perfect man, could die for men and women, boys and girls, in their sin, in the cancerous spread of sin across humanity. And so what God does in sending Christ, He invades humanity in the person of the God-man. It's not like mixing a a quart of God and a half a quart of man and kind of melding them together. No, you get the full quart, or the full perfection of deity, melded with, embedded with the fullness of humanity. So deity and humanity together, two natures, complete natures, one person, Christ. And for example, just give you one example. I was reading even today in Zechariah 12:10, an amazing verse, a prediction of the humanity of the Messiah. It says, but at the same verse, it says that this is God. But God cannot be pierced. Only humanity can be pierced. And it says in Zechariah 12:10, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. It's talking about the concluding time of the tribulation, perhaps the last days or hours. They will look upon me. They will look on me, says God, the one they have pierced. Whoa, wait a minute. Wasn't God speaking? Oh yes, it's very clear. Context, God is speaking. They will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him. The me is Christ's beginning the verse, and mourn for him is the Father ends the verse. You see the duality of the Father and the Son. God says in the person of Christ, they will look upon me whom they pierced, and they will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only son. So God captures us in his amazing humanity. I'm thinking of the powerful verse that comes from Hark the Herald Angels Sing. It says, late in time, behold him come, offspring of a virgin's womb. We've all sung these verses. We see them on the major Christmas movies all the time. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. Hail the incarnate deity. And our deity is incarnated, becomes flesh. And so it's powerful. Pleased as man with man to dwell. Jesus, or Emmanuel, means God's with us. But how could he be with us unless he became human? And when I think of Christ, I think of the wonder of him in his teenage years. Can you imagine Jesus as a teen? Just meditate on that. It'll keep you busy for about 6 months and maybe the rest of your life. So I'm thinking of how God captures us through this amazing process of invading at the time of Christmas, at the time of the birth of Christ. Of course, there was the 9 months, the period of development, as the fetal development takes place, and the whole perfection of that body and the soul and the spirit, not laced at all with the slightest drop of sin or tendency towards sin. And he comes out, he's perfect man. But secondly, not only do we see his humanity, we see his humility. Humility is a key aspect that captures our heart. I mean, God could have written the names of Christ and all these things in the stars that would impress us all. But God, as it were, humbled himself. It says in Philippians chapter 2, he laid aside the display, the usage of his attributes. He didn't consider equality God, the equality that he had with the Father. The Son did not consider that something to be held on too tightly. But he laid it aside, and he then helped each one of us, came to our rescue, is what he did. He offered himself in humility. And this is something that we didn't deserve. I mean, think of the humility of being born in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem to us is famous, but Bethlehem was a little forgotten podunk village. I mean, if you're going to prophesy in Florida terms of Christ's birth, you might say, oh, it'll be born in Tampa. Or maybe better yet, I don't know, born in London or Paris or Vienna. Think of being born, the prophecy that the Christ would come and be born in Odessa. Odessa? Where's that? I have to look it up on the map. He'll be born in Kenneth City. Have you ever heard of that? It's like 1 block big, down and snuggled in roughly in northern St. Pete. My wife went to a high school, Dixie Hollins. It's near Kenneth City. I mean, what is Kenneth City? I mean, you blink and you miss it, literally. You just go by one boulevard in the St. Pete area and you miss Kenneth City. So Jesus was not, on purpose, God designed it and engineered his entry into the world as a kind of a blip and you miss it. Blink and you miss it. And so we see the capture of our hearts, that he is born in a kingly line But there's no palace, okay? There's no retinue of people waiting on the king and the king's parents. He's born of humble parentage. They didn't have the money to go ahead and rent out a whole, condo. They were put out in the stable. They were not able to bring the highest monetary value offering at the circumcision of Jesus, the baby. They had to bring the turtle dove offering. And so we see this humility aspect. And third, and I think in many ways, most powerfully of all, we see him coming to not only humanity in humility, but we see him coming in sheer pure grace. Now, grace is, of course, one of the great words of Christian theology. It ranks up there with faith, Ephesians 2:8-9. By faith, by grace we are saved through faith. We see faith mentioned in many places. It is the modus operandi of God working in the world is through people trusting him by faith, but then it's always in conjunction with grace, his undeserved favor. And Jesus is coming in a form of utter and complete grace. As a matter of fact, one of the great passages in the Bible that really has worked its way deep into my heart is in Titus chapter 2. So I'm going to read this. This is so great. This is so powerful. I've got to just read the verses starting at verse 11. And it relates to the traditional January 6th Epiphany Day, the little at the lagoon here in Tarpon Springs. The Greek Orthodox Church has this tradition of throwing the cross into the bayou. And there's a big dock and a platform, and the teenagers all jump in. I actually know two, now they're grown up guys, they're men, the Nicholas family. But I know two guys who actually were able to swim down to the bottom of the lagoon and pick up the cross and burst through the surface, with a dripping cross in their arm. Well, that is Epiphany Day. That takes place always on the 6th of January. And people are, from the Greek Orthodox background are coming from everywhere to observe it. It's pretty cool. I've never been there, but I've seen it on TV probably 15 times. Well, you know what epiphany means? It comes from a Greek word. The root means to appear in the open suddenly. Something that was covered, that was hidden, suddenly has a ta-da appearance. And so the epiphany of Christ, the coming out, as it were, from behind the curtain, the appearance in public display of Christ is this grace. It's called grace has appeared. But what is grace talking about? It's talking about the baby that came. When Christ came, the baby came, grace came and captured our hearts. He came as a human. He came humble, but he came completely out of grace. We didn't deserve it. We deserve jail time. Or better yet, we deserve to be in the penitentiary, period, forever, of God's justice. But God said, I love you so much. There's such a powerful roaring. The Aslan figure of the Narnia tale is just like the roar of Aslan, the sheer power and unexpected piercing of the darkness of night by the roar of Aslan. That's a picture of God's roaring grace, because he comes at us and he says, you don't deserve it, but I'm going to turn my favor and love towards you and invite you to receive all my blessings. I mean, it's almost unbelievable, but it deeply touches our soul. So I'm sorry, I should have read this already. And we're looking at Titus, and we're looking to start at verse 11, and we'll go through 14. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. Let me repeat that. Think of the baby Jesus in the manger, held by Mary, nursing him, father, his stepfather, if you will, Joseph, caring for the whole situation. The grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. And then it adds, it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. Is that a little bit tough today? To say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, to say no to watching junk on the internet, to say no to lying or cheating or any one of 100 other things that we encounter, struggles we all struggle with. Yes, but they're the impelling motivation, the push, the tug, the heart capture that draws us to present this and receive God's help and His forgiveness and His victory is the grace of God. It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age while we wait for the blessed hope. The appearing, get this, the second coming. So the first coming draws us to wait for the second coming, to wait for the appearing, the blessed hope of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. And again, the one who came was none other than eternal Creator God. John says He crafted the universe. Colossians 1 says all things were made by Him and for Him. Hebrews 1 reminds us that He made the universe and He upholds it. He literally makes the molecules stick together day by day, moment by moment. And so we see in these three great passages, in Zechariah 12:10, He was pierced for our transgressions. He was literally God who was pierced. Secondly, we looked at Philippians chapter 2, which reminds us that God laid aside His glory for our sakes and became man. And thirdly, in this awesome Titus 2 passage, we see that the grace of God has come in and roared, has impassionedly invited us to receive all of His blessings. Now, how do we respond? When the invading army came in on June 6, 1944, D-Day, they had many, many people on the ground who were just kind of like, okay, the German soldiers were throwing down their arms, but their hearts weren't captured. They were still allied with Hitler. But others had already been preparing for the way of the Allies to come in and free their country. And they had been working continuously, and they, as it were, presented themselves as helpers of the recapture under the rightful king of the enemy-held territory. So we can come and every day, and I would just exhort myself and all of us to present our bodies a living sacrifice every single day, maybe 3 or 5 or 10 or more times a day is needed. But as we honor the one who has captured our heart, we realize He has a position in His royal army, in His captured enemy territory freedom force. We're freeing the captured territory that is held and oppressed under the wrong king. The tyrant is Satan and is now being liberated by Christ. So that's the challenge for each one of us. Thank you so much for listening to my thought about the one great heart capture, Jesus Christ. He loves us. We love Him in infinite terms, forever and ever. We are joined with Him. We are the bride of Christ. Have a great Christmas. See you here next semester at Trinity College of Florida.